Welcome to the Explainer. You know, when we flip through the pages of medieval Indian history, it is so incredibly easy to get distracted by the massive empires, right? The towering forts, the famous kings ruling from these grand capital cities. But today, we're doing something a little different. We are looking beyond those mainstream rulers to the hidden, dynamic movers of medieval India, the tribal and nomadic communities. These were the brilliant, resilient societies that literally powered the subcontinent's economy, connected its most distant lands, and honestly, profoundly shaped its social fabric. Let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with beyond Varnas and cities, look at life on the move, the rise of Jatis, the Gand kingdom, the Ahom state, and finally, how all of this created a changing subcontinent.
All right, Section 1, Beyond Varnas and Cities. So in large parts of the subcontinent, society was strictly divided by the rules of Varna. These were rigid rules prescribed by the Brahmanas and backed by the rulers of large kingdoms, which basically created a society with really stark differences, high and low, rich and poor. But, and this is crucial, vast stretches of the subcontinent operated completely differently. Tribal societies were fundamentally united by deep kinship bonds. Instead of a sharp divide in wealth and class, these groups actually controlled land and pastures jointly. They divided up resources among households based on their own internal rules.
And these independent tribes were absolutely not just isolated anomalies tucked away in some forgotten corner. No way. They thrived in almost every single region, from dense forested hills to remote deserts, basically places that were notoriously difficult for those big imperial armies to reach. Now, contemporary historians didn't write much about them, but these tribes preserved their own histories through incredibly rich oral traditions, passing down their vibrant cultures from generation to generation.
Moving right along to Section 2, Life on the Move.
These nomadic groups engaged in a massive spectrum of livelihoods. You had hunter-gatherers like the Bhils, who sustained themselves entirely off the rich forests, but then you also had these highly mobile traders, who essentially acted as the grand connectors of medieval India. They moved over huge distances with their animals, swapping pastoral products like wool and ghee with settled farmers in exchange for grain, cloth, and utensils. They were literally weaving the entire subcontinent's economy together.
And when we talk about trade, we absolutely have to talk about the Banjaras. They were hands down the most vital trader nomads of the era. Their whole way of life revolved around something called the tunda. A tunda was this sprawling, migrating caravan that transported their entire households, wives, children, you name it, along with tremendous quantities of goods. They were so important that Sultan Al-Din Khalji famously relied on the Banjaras just to transport grain into the vital city markets.
To really grasp the scale of their operations, just think about this number, 100,000. Emperor Jahangir actually noted in his memoirs that the Banjaras transported food grain for the mighty Mughal army during their vast military campaigns. And to feed an army of that size, the Banjaras would deploy up to 100,000 grain-carrying bullocks at a single time. It's just staggering.
We actually have this fantastic first-hand account from Peter Mundy, who was an English trader in the early 17th century. He wrote, "In the morning, we met a tanda of Banjaras with 14,000 oxen. They do not travel more than 6 or 7 miles a day." I love this quote because it perfectly captures how these vast, migrating merchant families functioned as the absolute lifeblood of trade, buying grain on the cheap in one region and slowly, methodically moving it to places where it was scarce and highly valuable.
Okay, Section 3, The Rise of Jatis.
As the economy grew and became much more complex, that rigid, four-tiered Varna system just wasn't cutting it anymore. Society needed highly specialized skills. So to adapt, smaller specialized castes called Jatis started to emerge. Suddenly, specialized artisans, your smiths, carpenters, masons, were being recognized as separate Jatis by the Brahmanas. And importantly, as tribal families gained wealth and power, their leading families were absorbed right into the established caste system. In fact, many of the new Rajput clans that became super powerful in the 11th and 12th centuries actually had tribal origins. They literally laid the groundwork for the complex social structures we still study today.
Let's look at a specific example in Section 4, the Gand kingdom.
The Gands lived in this vast forested region called Gondwana. To survive and thrive in such a dense environment, they practiced shifting cultivation.
Basically, they'd clear and burn a patch of trees and bushes, sow their crops right into the nutrient-rich ashes, and then, once the soil inevitably lost its fertility, they'd just pack up and clear a new plot. This highly adaptable method allowed the extensive Gan tribe, which was divided into many smaller clans, to sustain a really large and flourishing population.
Now, as the power of the Delhi Sultan started to decline, these Gan clans began to centralize. According to the Akbarnama, the famous history of Emperor Akbar's reign, the Gan kingdom of Garha Katanga grew so massive and politically sophisticated that it governed an astounding 70,000 villages. They divided their kingdom into these highly organized administrative units called Gars and Chaurasis. This completely transformed their once equal society into one with very distinct social classes.
But, of course, an empire that wealthy inevitably attracts attention. In 1565, Mughal forces attacked Garha Katanga. The defense was led by the incredibly capable Rani Durgawati, who was ruling on behalf of her 5-year-old son. She put up this fierce, totally legendary resistance against the Mughals. And when defeat became inevitable, Rani Durgawati famously chose to die fighting rather than surrender her kingdom.
Up next, Section 5, the Ahom State.
The Ahoms migrated to the Brahmaputra Valley in the 13th century, and they rapidly centralized their power using some very aggressive strategic steps. First, they suppressed the older political systems of local landlords, and then they annexed neighboring kingdoms. But what's really fascinating is that long before many of their rivals, they were early adopters of heavy weaponry. They were using firearms as early as the 1530s, and by the 1660s, they were manufacturing high-quality gunpowder and cannons to defend their growing state.
But the true backbone of the Ahom state was a unique administrative structure called the pike system. This was an intense, highly organized forced labor system. The state conducted a really strict census, and every single village was required to send a quota of workers, known as pikes, by rotation. The Ahoms deliberately shifted people around from heavily populated areas to less populated ones, which effectively broke up those old clan loyalties to ensure total reliance on the centralized state.
What's so interesting here is the profound duality of the Ahom state. Despite relying on this strict forced labor system, their society was deeply sophisticated. They heavily patronized the arts. The state granted land to poets and scholars. They encouraged local theater, and they translated important Sanskrit works. And crucially, they wrote these incredibly detailed historical records known as Burunjis, making sure their unique history was meticulously documented for us to find.
Finally, Section 6, a changing subcontinent. So what's the big picture here? The history of medieval India isn't just a simple, boring timeline of static, unmoving empires. It is defined by a constant, centuries-long interaction between Varna-based societies and tribal people. Over time, many tribes merged right into the caste system to fill new economic roles. Others rejected those orthodox structures entirely. And some, as we saw with the Gans and Ahoms, built formidable centralized kingdoms of their own. The absolute key takeaway is that both types of societies were fundamentally forced to adapt, to borrow from one another, and to evolve forever.
I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If history is so often written by the victors sitting in their grand capital cities, how did this unending cycle of conflict and dependence between these hidden nomadic movers and massive empires permanently wire the DNA of the culture we see today? Think about that the next time you look at a map. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep